Hi, I'm Dr. Matthew Joby. I'm come to you today with some thoughts that have been swimming around in my mind regarding poetry and the music lesson. These thoughts appear in my most recent blog from Psychology Today, Mindfulness and Music blog. Back in my youth, in my conservatory days studying, there was a fellow classmate, and he was telling us that when he went to his trumpet lesson each week, his professor would have him read a selection of poetry before the lesson, to start the lesson. Now, this was intriguing to me. I think it was intriguing to me then for different reasons than it is intriguing to me now. And it's an idea that has just stayed with me. And I think at the time, there was something exciting about someone doing something unusual. And I think in our adolescence, that's very appealing when we find an adult or someone who is doing something atypical and getting interesting results from that. It's almost, I think it appeals to the adolescent's enthusiasm for making change, etc. There's a certain affection in adolescence for revolution, maybe. Well, at any rate, so this idea of reading a poem before starting the music lesson in adult life, it conjured up some thoughts in my mind from the theory of poetry, aesthetic theory and poetry, the other from Zen Buddhism, and the other stream that comes into this convergence is from continental philosophy. I'm speaking of Wallace Stevens' idea in his collection of essays called The Necessary Angel, D.T. Suzuki's essay in Eric Fromm's book Zen Buddhism and Psychoanalysis, and Martin Heidegger's on the Way to Poetry. Let me make sure I got that title correct. Poetry, Language, Thought. On the Way to Poetry is, I think, an essay within here. So these three streams of thought about why and what is special about reading poetry at the beginning of a music lesson. Well, let's start with the Wallace Stevens idea. Wallace Stevens, in one of his essays in The Necessary Angel, discusses that there are certain moods that come to dominate an epoch. So I guess a Hegelian would call this the Zeitgeist, the spirit of the time. And he describes that there can be, in language use, there can be a emphasis on either a predominance of the use of denotative or connotative language. And in semiotics and in phenomenology, we talk about denotation and connotation. Denotation describes something. What you're talking about is what you're talking about. Connotative is like poetry. It's not talking directly about the thing you're talking about. It's connotating maybe a more universal idea, or as Ralph Waldo Emerson discusses this. My goodness, a fourth stream. Emerson often uses analogical reasoning. That means seeing connections and patterns between seemingly disparate things. Seeing connections is a big part of this. Well, if we think about this idea, it correlates very interestingly, this idea of a preponderance of denotative spirit and connotative spirit in a certain given time period. We might see the denotative during this Enlightenment and the connotative in Romanticism. In intellectual history, we often talk about classicism versus Romanticism, or we might talk about realism versus nominalism, or even realism versus or objectivism versus idealism. And these have specific meanings within philosophy. So idealism isn't talking about feeling positive about something. It's talking about a Kantian idea that the idea, the mind, is participating in the meaning making, not just simply an object that has meaning in isolation. Relationships. This is all about context and relationships. Well, if we think about D.T. Suzuki's essay and Eric Fromm's Zen Buddhism and Psychoanalysis, Suzuki makes an illustration of the difference between Western science and Eastern science. And we're talking here in Eastern science about Chinese, Japanese, Asian, Indian, Asian cultures. The emphasis, as he describes, if you want to know a flower, in Western science, we dissect the flower, we cut it up, we, as he says, destroy it in order to know it, and get down to that cellular level. And the assumption here is that that the more you dissect something, the more you reduce it down, it's called reductionism, the closer you get to its cause or its essence. And this is like the word effect. As soon as you use a term like effect, it begs the question of causation. Begging the question means it's an assumption that one needs to question. The idea that there is a cause, or that reducing something down to a smaller causes the larger. Suzuki contrasts this with Eastern science, again using science and scientia, the acquisition of knowledge. And in Buddhist science, one contemplates the flower, one sits with the flower, one meditates on the flower. And in so doing, one comes to know the flower. In Suzuki's book, a poem is then written about the flower. This is interesting. Use of connotative language. I might even think that there's a link here, or a very interesting conversation we had between the difference between induction and deduction, in inductive thought and deductive thought. Well, the third stream here, of course, is Heidegger's idea of poetry and dwelling, poetry, thinking, and dwelling. And Heidegger makes a distinction between the ontic and the ontological. The ontic would be the denotative description of the thing. That's the stuff we do in objective empiricism, the ontic. The ontological is connotative in this sense. It gets beyond, it's talking about something that is behind or underneath or beyond, maybe something that is unspeakable. Isn't that what music is? Something that's unspeakable. As soon as we start trying to put words into describing music, we run into a problem. And I'd say that this is because music itself is a connotative language. It's something to do, we get something from music, we learn something from it, we're experiencing something from it, but we're not quite sure, we're at a loss to put that into words. We leave a piece of music being changed forever. And I don't think that's hyperbole. I think that we really get, the reason we listen to music is because it moves us. I'm not talking about text where the words tell us possibly what to think. We could have more poetic text, more connotative text, more literal text. Oh, I love you. I miss you. That's a very denotative kind of statement. But then we could have more poetic text, perhaps in a song, 19th century song from Schumann or Brahms. And we have a more connotative language. But if we just take music, harmony, melody, tempo, time, and rhythm, and we experience this and gather something from it, it's a connotative experience. In other words, it's beyond the literal denotative use of language. Heidegger urges us to abandon thinking and move into dwelling. And dwelling is something we do in poetry. We dwell in something. One of my teachers would always have me play my scales on trombone at the beginning of to warm up the scales, and he would always tell me to play the scale beautifully. Every note that came out had to have expression. Pablo Casals talks about little rainbows in the book Casals on Conducting. Every phrase of music, including a scale, begins and builds in intensity and then releases again. There's little rainbows in the phrase. And this is relationship, building and releasing, soft, loud, maybe speeding up a little bit, rubato, slowing down, coming down. It's almost has a connotative or poetic relationship with an isometric effect of the willow tree weeping, or the waves coming in and receiving, or I think some third movement of Third Symphony of Brahms, it has the feeling of this blowing, swaying breeze of the ocean. These are poetic connotations. So this teacher asks a student to read poetry before the lesson. And I think the wisdom in this is the exercise of balance. A reminder from the beginning of the lesson, a setting of the tone, the setting of the mood, that the technique, the articulation, the fingering, the playing of the scale, the accuracy, the knowledge of the craft, the technique, is not an end in itself. It's a means to a more poetic end. And that's the distinction that one can arrive at when setting the mood with poetry. Thanks for listening, and check out the blog.